Palm trees swaying in the breeze. Ocean waves brushing the sand and high-rise condos gleaming under the Florida sun. This was the dream sold to generations of homebuyers and investors. South Florida in particular became a beacon for people chasing wealth, warmth, and a better life. From the Art Deco streets of Miami Beach to the glittering towers rising over Brickell, the skyline itself seemed to promise not just shelter, but profit, a piece of paradise that would always appreciate in value. For decades, people poured in. Retirees from the Northeast, investors from South America, families looking for opportunity, and developers who couldn't build fast enough to meet demand. Condos were marketed not just as homes, but as tickets into a booming future, a hedge against uncertainty elsewhere in the world. And for years, that promise held true. But in 2025, the glow has started to dim. South Florida's condo market is no longer the golden ticket it once was. It's become one of the riskiest bets in American real estate. The numbers tell a story of sharp reversals. Sales dropping by more than 20% in Miami-Dade County, inventories swelling to levels not seen since the aftermath of the Great Recession, and prices slipping in ways that once seemed unthinkable. For the first time in years, it's not the sellers calling the shots. Buyers are negotiating harder, waiting longer, and walking away from deals they would have fought for just a few years ago. A market that once seemed unstoppable is now flooded with units, many of them aging, many of them burdened by costs their owners can no longer carry. This shift didn't happen overnight. It's the product of years of compounding pressures that collided in dramatic fashion. The pandemic boom drove prices to unsustainable highs. The Surfside tragedy rewrote the rules for building safety and condo reserves, and the insurance crisis sent costs through the roof for anyone trying to hold on to property. Add in higher mortgage rates and the steady retreat of foreign buyers, once the lifeblood of Miami's condo scene, and suddenly, paradise looks a lot more precarious. The story of Florida's housing market in 2025 isn't just about numbers on a spreadsheet. It's about the end of a dream, or at least the reimagining of it, as people come to grips with a new reality. Spike in Florida condo supply is creating a buyer's market. The New York Times. The turning point came in June of 2021, when the Champlain Towers South in Surfside collapsed in the middle of the night, killing 98 people and sending shockwaves through Florida and the entire country. The disaster was a wake-up call, a moment when the glossy brochures and endless promises of oceanfront living could no longer hide the truth. That much of Florida's condo stock was aging, underfunded, and in need of massive repairs. What had once been sold as worry-free living suddenly looked fragile, even dangerous, and the state, under immense pressure, had no choice but to act. In the years that followed, lawmakers rolled out some of the strictest condo laws in the nation. By the end of 2024, associations were required to complete milestone inspections for any building 30 years or older, and to conduct expensive reserve studies every decade. These weren't just bureaucratic boxes to tick, they carried heavy price tags. For many associations, it meant hundreds of thousands, or even millions, of dollars in structural repairs. The cost of maintaining paradise had finally come due, and there was no putting it off anymore. Homeowners who had bought condos expecting stable HOA fees suddenly faced steep special assessments. Some owners were hit with bills in the tens of thousands payable almost immediately. Retirees on fixed incomes were forced to make heartbreaking choices: cash in their savings, take out loans, or sell quickly before the costs buried them further. But as thousands of people tried to sell at the same time, the market tilted. Inventory ballooned. By early 2025, there were more than 73,000 condo listings statewide, nearly 25% higher than the year before. In South Florida, the glut reached a staggering 10 months' worth of supply, the most since 2011. The new laws did what they were supposed to do. They made buildings safer, forced transparency, and ensured money would be set aside for repairs. But they also ripped away the illusion that condos were easy, affordable entry points into Florida real estate. Buyers grew wary, asking harder questions about inspection deadlines and reserve balances. Lenders started to step back too, blacklisting buildings that hadn't passed inspections or didn't have the required reserves. Entire towers found themselves cut off from conventional financing, leaving owners with no way to attract average buyers who needed mortgages. What had once been a ticket to stability now looked like a liability, and the ripple effects were felt across every part of the market. Between 2015 and 2022, South Florida became one of the most feverish housing markets in the United States. A magnet that drew people money and speculation in equal measure. The appeal wasn't hard to understand. Year-round sunshine, no state income tax, and a lifestyle of beaches and palm trees that felt like an instant upgrade for families escaping the cold or the high costs of northern metros. Every month, thousands of new residents streamed in from New York, New Jersey, Illinois, and California, often armed with bigger salaries than local workers could dream of. This steady wave of migration added relentless pressure on housing demand. Investors smelled opportunity and they poured in with a vengeance. Private equity firms began snapping up suburban homes by the dozen, converting them into rentals that they could hold for years. Foreign buyers from Latin America and Europe added another layer of heat, treating Miami condos as both vacation homes and safe deposit boxes for their wealth. Their all-cash offers often bulldozed local families out of bidding wars, turning neighborhoods into playgrounds for investors rather than homes for residents. Then came the pandemic, which acted like jet fuel on a market that was already burning hot. Remote work rewrote the playbook for millions of Americans who suddenly realized they didn't have to pay San Francisco or Manhattan prices to live in a cramped apartment. If work could be done on a laptop, why not do it with a pool in the backyard and the beach 20 minutes away? Florida, with its looser COVID restrictions compared to much of the country, quickly became the #1 destination. The result was a housing frenzy unlike anything locals had ever seen. Bidding wars became routine, with homes selling in days or even hours. Properties went tens of thousands over asking, often with no inspection contingencies. Sellers would receive a dozen offers in a single weekend, many from out-of-state buyers flashing cash. By 2022, Miami's median home price had jumped by more than 80% since 2015. Fort Lauderdale and West Palm Beach weren't far behind, each transforming from secondary cities into red-hot destinations in their own right. For developers, it was a golden era. Luxury condos sprouted along the coastline like glass and steel mushrooms after rain, and inland communities expanded at a breakneck pace. The mood in those years was almost euphoric. Analysts called Florida's housing bulletproof, promising endless upside. Realtors boasted about families buying homes sight unseen, bidding off virtual tours and drone videos. It felt unstoppable, as if the Sunshine State had discovered a housing cheat code that would keep values climbing forever. But beneath the shine, there were already signs of stress. Wages weren't keeping pace with soaring home values. Affordability for locals collapsed, with housing costs consuming unsustainable portions of income. Insurance premiums were quietly climbing, driven by climate risks and a shaky underwriting market. And developers, encouraged by endless demand, were building more luxury supply than the market could realistically sustain. The seeds of the current crash were planted in those very years of excess. By late 2023, the fever dream of Florida real estate was showing its first signs of fatigue. The same market that once seemed untouchable began to wobble, and for the first time in nearly a decade, sellers felt a chill. Mortgage rates, which had hovered near historic lows during the pandemic, suddenly shot up. A 30-year fixed loan that once came with a 3% interest rate now cost more than double, hovering around 7%. For buyers, that meant a monthly payment that ballooned by hundreds, sometimes thousands of dollars overnight. The frenzy of all-cash offers slowed, and financing became a burden too heavy for many first-timers to shoulder. In Miami-Dade County, inventories that had been razor-thin began creeping upward. Where there had once been just a few weeks' worth of homes on the market, by early 2024, supply was stretching into months. Fort Lauderdale saw price reductions become routine, with sellers cutting $20,000 to $50,000, even $100,000 off their initial listings to lure hesitant buyers. The once unshakable balance of power was shifting. Buyers, no longer desperate, were in control. The national headlines began to change too. Florida was no longer just the poster child for sunshine and growth. It was being flagged as overheated. Analysts pointed to affordability metrics that had fallen to the worst levels in the country. In Miami, the average household now needed to spend more than 60% of its income just to afford a median-priced home, with insurance and taxes factored in. For many locals, the numbers simply didn't add up. The housing dream was slipping out of reach. By the spring of 2024, whispers of a slowdown had become too loud to ignore. Pending sales dipped sharply, signaling a drop in future closings. New construction, once a roaring engine of Florida's growth, started to stall. Developers faced higher borrowing costs and an uncertain buyer pool, leaving projects half-finished or postponed indefinitely. Foreclosures, which had been almost non-existent during the boom, began creeping back into the picture, especially in Broward and Palm Beach counties where overstretched families and speculative investors struggled to keep up. The cracks weren't only financial, they were psychological. Realtors who had built their careers on quick flips and easy commissions suddenly found themselves chasing buyers who wouldn't commit. Homeowners who bought in 2021 or 2022, convinced they had secured their slice of paradise, watched in horror as values began to tick downward. Equity that had once felt like free money was evaporating. In community meetings and coffee shop conversations, unease grew. Some residents asked whether the so-called bulletproof market had always been a mirage. Others wondered if Florida was replaying the early stages of the 2008 housing crash. The questions hung heavy unanswered as the foundations of South Florida's housing story began to shift. By the time 2025 arrived, what had begun as a slowdown had grown into something much darker. The South Florida housing market wasn't just cooling anymore, it was unraveling in plain sight. Homes that once vanished in days with multiple offers were now lingering for weeks, sometimes months. Sellers slashed their asking prices, sometimes 3 or 4 times, just to get a single offer through the door. The frenzy was gone, replaced by a heavy silence at open houses and a creeping sense of dread in neighborhood after neighborhood. The numbers painted a sobering picture. Across Miami-Dade, home prices had fallen nearly 5% year over year, a figure that stung even more in a region where values had seemed destined only to rise. Tampa's drop was steeper, over 6%, and Cape Coral, one of the darlings of the pandemic boom, was hit hardest of all, with home values plunging by more than 11% in just 2 years. Suddenly, thousands of homeowners found themselves underwater, owing more on their mortgages than their homes were worth. Nearly half the listings in Cape Coral were marked down, an unthinkable reversal from the bidding wars that defined the years before. But it wasn't only about falling prices. The very rhythm of the market shifted. By mid-2025, the average Florida home was taking weeks, sometimes months to sell. Inventory ballooned by over 9%, giving buyers far more choices and far more leverage than they'd had in years. Redfin reported that nearly 1 in 7 pending home sales fell through in May, the highest collapse rate since 2017. Deals that once felt like sure things were collapsing in the final stages, leaving buyers spooked and sellers furious. What used to be a feeding frenzy now looked more like a ghost town. The condo market was its own nightmare. After the 2021 Surfside tragedy, Florida's new Building Safety Act had forced older high-rises into strict and costly repairs. Thousands of buildings faced mandatory renovations, and owners were slapped with special assessments that ranged from tens of thousands to well over $100,000 per unit. Many residents simply couldn't pay. Lawsuits broke out between condo boards, and owners' units sat vacant, and lenders blacklisted more than 1,400 buildings from financing altogether. Without access to mortgages, potential buyers fled, leaving towers half empty and trapping owners who had no way to sell without massive losses. And then there was the insurance crisis. What had been a slow burn in the background suddenly became front-page news. Premiums that had already doubled or tripled since 2020 climbed even higher, with the average Floridian paying nearly $6,000 a year just to insure their home. In coastal areas like Fort Myers and Punta Gorda, premiums shot into the 5 figures. For many retirees living on fixed incomes, it was simply unsustainable. They weren't just choosing between vacations or luxuries, they were cutting back on groceries, healthcare, and basic needs just to keep their homes covered. Families who once dreamed of raising children by the beach began quietly listing their houses and moving inland or out of state altogether. By the summer of 2025, fear was no longer confined to balance sheets. It was lived experience. Local news stations aired footage of half-empty open houses, sellers slashing prices mid-tour, and homeowners breaking down at community meetings. In Broward County, a nurse named Maria Lopez spoke for many when she admitted she was trapped. She bought her first home in 2022 for $420,000. By mid-2025, it was worth just $360,000, while her insurance premiums and taxes kept climbing. "If I sell, I lose everything. If I stay, I can't afford it," she said. Her story echoed across living rooms throughout South Florida, a haunting reminder that for many the dream had turned into a nightmare. The panic was contagious. Realtors whispered about stalled sales, contractors complained of empty project calendars, and staging companies, once booked solid, now had half their inventory sitting unused. Investors, too, began to back away. Hedge funds and corporate landlords that once gobbled up properties by the dozen started selling off their portfolios, preferring to take smaller profits now than risk bigger losses later. Airbnb hosts grumbled about declining bookings as oversupply hit the short-term rental market. Blocks of condos in Miami Beach and Fort Lauderdale sat eerily quiet in the off-season. Their lights out, their promise of easy income shattered. By late 2025, South Florida no longer looked like the bulletproof real estate haven it had once been marketed as. Instead, it was a region at a crossroads caught between stubborn optimism and hard economic reality. The beaches were still golden, the palm trees still swayed, but beneath the postcard image, the foundation of the housing market was cracking, and everyone could feel it. More condos and homes are on the market in South Florida as sales drop. NBC6 South Florida. Beneath the numbers and regulations lies the human side of Florida's condo crisis. The stories that don't always make it into the spreadsheets but are written across everyday lives. Retirees who once imagined living out their golden years on a balcony overlooking Biscayne Bay or the Gulf are suddenly squeezed by assessment bills that dwarf their monthly pensions. A widow in her 70s, for example, might face a $120,000 repair levy, more than she paid for her unit 3 decades ago. For many, the only option is to sell, but with a flooded market and falling prices, that sale often feels less like a nest egg and more like a forced surrender. Renters are caught in their own bind. As owners offload units to cover costs or simply walk away, rental supply shifts. Some condos restrict renting altogether during renovations, while others see landlords passing down their skyrocketing insurance premiums and association fees in the form of higher monthly rents. For a young family trying to stay close to schools or jobs in Miami, Fort Lauderdale, or Tampa, that means either stretching their budget thin or moving farther inland away from the waterfront lifestyle that once felt within reach. Small businesses, too, feel the ripple effect. Neighborhood cafes, dry cleaners, and yoga studios that depend on condo residents for daily traffic are seeing fewer customers. When owners tighten their belts to cover assessments, discretionary spending disappears. When renters move out because of rising costs, the customer base shrinks. Even real estate agents, once thriving on bidding wars and quick commissions, are scrambling for clients in a market now defined by hesitation and fear. What makes this moment particularly poignant is that the very people who fueled Florida's condo dream, the retirees seeking sunshine, the workers chasing opportunity, the entrepreneurs banking on steady growth, are the ones now feeling its collapse most acutely. Their stories remind us that real estate is never just about property. It's about people's stability and the fragile promise of home. In the end, Florida's condo market tells a story that stretches far beyond property values or quarterly reports. It's the story of a dream that rose, collapsed, and is now trying to rebuild itself. The boom years of migration, remote work, and investor cash painted Florida's skyline with glittering towers and promises of easy living. Then came Surfside, a tragedy that pulled back the curtain, exposing decades of deferred costs and structural neglect. The shock didn't just change laws, it changed the very psychology of what it means to live in a Florida condo. Now, foreign buyers have thinned out. Retirees are squeezed by assessments, renters are caught in the middle, and small businesses struggle to keep their doors open. What was once a seller's paradise has become a buyer's market with more listings than buyers and more uncertainty than confidence. Yet within this downturn lies something more than loss. It's also a moment of reckoning. Stricter regulations, tougher inspections, and higher transparency mean that the condos that survive this cycle will, in theory, be safer, stronger, and more trustworthy. The market is reshaping itself like Florida's coastline after a storm. Battered, changed, but not erased. For some, this moment marks the painful end of a chapter. For others, it's the rare chance to step into ownership in a place that once felt out of reach. And for Florida itself, it's a reminder that its real estate story has always been cyclical, defined by booms, crashes, resilience, and reinvention. The towers may look the same against the skyline, but beneath them, everything has shifted. What happens next will determine whether the Florida condo dream can rise again, or whether it will remain for many a cautionary tale about what happens when the foundations we build our lives on prove more fragile than we ever imagined.